one of the things you talk about is going up against this notion that we just got to get the right people in office. Your point, you make this all over the place, is that politicians are rational. They're just going to follow the incentives.
If you are totally hostage to the extremes, there's no incentive to do so. I think most people would say what we have isn't working. So the question becomes like, okay, it's not working. It impacts your life. You have to invest in a solution.
Digging into some of the reasons that people don't show up to vote, the top 3 reasons cited are they don't know enough about the candidates, they don't care, or they're too busy. Obviously, mobile voting theoretically solves the problem of too busy, but curious what other innovations we'll need to see in the political domain to fix the information problem or the not interested problem.
You don't care because you're apathetic. You're apathetic because you think that nothing can get done because the system is so broken and dysfunctional. I think once we can start changing underlying incentives and making the system more functional again, then more people will restore their faith in government, and we do care.
I can't agree more with your sense of the low turnout in primaries as an existential threat. I'm kind of curious whether you see the model that we're pushing, which is universal delivery of all ballots. Is it helpful? Is it complementary? Or is it in some ways a competition to your vision?
My only goal is just to maximize access and turnout, right? Because I just feel like you said, the only way to move things more towards the middle is to decrease sort of the extremes kind of controlling the primary turnout process.
Hi, everybody. I'm John Updike. I'm really excited to speak with Bradley Tusk today. I met Bradley in 2009 when he was Mike Bloomberg's campaign manager for his re-election campaign as mayor of New York City. And Bradley has gone on to become a really successful investor, philanthropist, podcaster, and bookstore owner. And he's one of the sharpest political and business minds that I know. And he has written a great book called Vote with Your Phone. So welcome, Bradley. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. I should correct you in one area, John. I'm not sure there's such a thing as a successful bookstore owner, but if there is, I am definitely not one of them. We lose tons of money.
There you go. I have a million questions. Before we dive in, though, I just want to show a short clip of an interview you recently gave on Squawk Box on CNBC. Go ahead, sure. Russ, roll the clip.
We have an electoral system that drives polarization. Because of gerrymandering, the only election that typically matters is the primary. Primary turnout is typically around 10%. Who are those voters? They are the far left, they are the far right, or they are special interests that can move money and votes in low turnout primaries. And as a result, the underlying incentives for politicians who just want to stay in office at any cost is to cater to those groups. Right. And those groups are angry. Those groups are mean. And so all of the incentives, if you want to keep your job, is to echo that rhetoric. And so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Okay, so I always argue there's too much money in politics. But if you could actually use the money for good, meaning to take the influence that you have, you don't see, frankly, wealthy donors actually say, I'm not supporting all of this craziness. They say, well, it's a binary thing, and I just have to decide, I like this guy better than this guy, so I'm just going to do it.
Yeah, I personally think that if we were to put our money, and this is something that I'm doing with my money, into structural reform of the system as opposed to just backing more and more candidates doing the same thing, that's how you change it. So, for example, out of my foundation, we've been building technology that will allow people to vote securely on their phones, because what I learned, especially when I ran all the campaigns to legalize Uber around the U.S., is that if you let people advocate politically from their phones, vastly more will do so, and that increases turnout, and you go from that 10% to 30%.
Right.
That's great. That sets up our whole conversation. So I just want to say, Bradley, I really, really like this book. And full disclosure, I didn't think I would like it. I'm kind of predisposed to be suspicious of technological fixes to kind of social political problems. That's kind of my starting point.
But
I know, and I loved this book. And part of what my experience of it was, you're not advocating for a tech shift or a tech hack. You're advocating for a culture shift. Yeah. And the culture of consumer involvement is companies make it as easy as possible. They bend over backwards to get people to be able to participate. And the political culture is the exact opposite. So I read this book and I'm like, oh, Bradley's talking about changing the culture. Did I get that wrong? Am I reading into it?
In many ways, this is a behavioral economics experiment, right? I am making two bets that I believe will be right, and all of my work to date has told me that it's right, but we'll see. The first is that if we make voting radically easier to access, a lot more people will do it. And just to be clear, I'm not proposing that mobile voting replace any form of voting. I'm just saying let's give people an additional secure option to vote. And then second, and even more importantly, the bet that I'm making is if turnout increases from say 10% to 30%, and that moves things to the middle, politicians will shift accordingly, because if their only goal is to stay in office, and that has effectively been my experience, and I should just give you guys, some background so you know that I'm hopefully qualified to talk about this. As John mentioned, I've worked in city government. I was Mike Bloomberg's campaign manager. I also worked for him at City Hall. I was the deputy governor of Illinois for 4 years. I ran the state's budget, operations, legislation, policy, and communications. I spent a couple of years in Washington as the communications director for Chuck Schumer. So I've worked in the executive branch, the legislative branch. I've run campaigns. I've kind of seen this from every angle all over the country. And the thing that I took away from all of this is every policy output is the result of the political elite.
Right.
Every politician makes every decision solely based on the next election and nothing else. And the bad news is we'd like to be better people and they're not. But the good news is they'll adapt to whatever they need to adapt to stay in office. Yeah.
And there's a great story in your book about when politicians don't do that, when they break even the tiniest little break, like the story about Chris Jacobs up in Buffalo.
Yeah.
Who, conservative Republican, but then there's a mass shooting and he decides to take a little step, a tiny micro step in favor of some gun regulation. And basically it's the end of his political career. Can you just elaborate on that story and like how you see mobile voting impacting on scenarios like that?
Sure. And also Ramon sent me a note about the mics. Ramon, I pressed a button that hopefully fixed the problem, but shoot me the text if it didn't. So Chris Jacobs was a congressman from upstate New York, Western New York, in the Buffalo area, and total MAGA Republican, voted not to certify the, election of 2020, endorsed by Trump, all of that. But as you may remember, there was a shooting in a supermarket in Buffalo a couple of years ago. 10 people were killed, and it happened to be about a mile from where Jacobs' office is, and he was really shaken by it. And at a press conference, he said, we got to do something about this, right? We can't just let people keep, getting guns easily and slaughtering innocent people. And simply because he just said, hey, we ought to look at a different law. It was September of 2022, so he was up for re-election in 2 months. The Conservative Party line and the Republican Party line were both stripped from him. He wasn't able to run for re-election just 2 months later. His entire career ended simply because he dared to say, hey, why don't we think about a different solution? But if in his primary turnout were, say, 35% instead of 12%, if you just look at the polling among Republicans on gun issues, he would have been rewarded for saying that because more people would say, yeah, we should have some sort of reasonable rules in place. And if you think about guns in general, 70 to 80% of Americans would agree with this statement. We should neither confiscate everyone's guns, nor should it be easy to buy an assault weapon. The problem is that 70 to 80% don't vote in primaries, and so their views effectively don't matter. And we're stuck with the extremes, and that's why we have school shootings, that's why we have supermarket shootings, that's why we have Walmart shootings, church shootings, and everything else.
Yeah, boy, there's so many stories of just elected officials who, if they step out of line with their own party for 2 seconds, they just get crucified in the primary. One of the other things I really liked about this book, Bradley, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but there's ways in which you skewer kind of ivory tower opposition to this.
Sure.
Kind of some liberal elite, like kind of like disconnected from the scrum of American politics, how it really works. So how would you describe, what are the disingenuous arguments against mobile voting? And then what are the honest arguments against?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Sure. So, look, the disingenuous ones are things like, oh, we're going to have widespread voter coercion where people are going to hold a gun to a stranger's head and demand that they vote a certain way on their phones. If the problem was that voting was so sought after and popular that
Right.
people were resorting to the theft, we wouldn't have a turnout problem in the first place, and we wouldn't need to do mobile voting, right? Or that there would be vast vote fraud. The Heritage Foundation did a study and found, and keep in mind, the Heritage Foundation is a conservative organization. The number of votes typically affected by voter fraud is 0.0000506. So basically, it doesn't occur. And like I said, I worked in Chicago politics. It doesn't get worse than that. We didn't have voter fraud. It's not a real thing. Maybe it was once upon a time, but it's not today. So those are the disingenuous arguments. The valid argument to make, and one that I hope that we have been able to address or are addressing, is security, right? So, we've polled this, nationally, and most people would agree with the statement of, if mobile voting is secure, of course you should be able to vote that way, just like we do our banking online and our healthcare online and our Love Lives online and everything else. So the question is it secure? So the US Vote Foundation wrote a report saying the following would need to be present in mobile voting technology for it to be secure: end-to-end encryption, end-to-end verifiability, multi-factor authentication, biometric screening, air-gapped, and open source. And that's what we have been building. And we are going to release the technology when we have completed in a way that, one, all of our security experts are happy with, and two, we're then going to go to security organizations like NIST, the National Institute for Standards Technology, and get their opinion on it. And once everyone has said, yes, we believe that this meets the requirements and is secure, we will then make it free and open source. All this is philanthropic. It's out of my foundation. I've spent about $20 million of my own money so far to try to move this forward. And I've made money, but not so much that that's, a drop in the bucket for me. That's most of my money. My view is that we need a scalable solution to fix the turnout problem. If we don't fix the turnout problem, you're never going to change the behavior of politicians. If you don't change their behavior, if you don't incentivize them to work together, we're never going to fix our underlying, policy problems. And the only way to change their incentives and behavior is to radically increase primary turnout. And the only way to do that from a scalable standpoint is to let them people be able to vote in the device that's already in their pockets.
Yeah, I mean, my colleagues and I talk about this all the time, that one of the challenge we have in the primary reform world is, yes, we have to change the laws. I mean, there's closed primaries all over the country. There's bad laws, but it's much deeper than that. Most Americans don't think about voting in the primary. That's where the hardcore partisans vote, and then we regular people vote in November. And I can't think of a better way to change that mindset than actually just put it on your phone. That's like, because people do their phone every day of the year. Right. And it's again, I went in skeptical and I came out really enthusiastic, because I just see you could shift people's mentality if primary day was people doing something on their phone.
Yeah, I mean, look, you and I have worked together on open primary campaigns, and imagine if anyone could participate in a primary and you could do it on your phone, and in a perfect world, maybe you have a couple of weeks to vote and not just one day. Then all of a sudden, all of the underlying incentives that open primaries are meant to drive, which is more cooperation, more centrism, less negativity, really lead to productive legislative activity that solves issues like education or guns or healthcare, or immigration or housing, or whatever you want, because that's ultimately the real goal of open primaries, is to then recreate the structures of government so that we can then be effective and make people's lives better. If you could take the power of open primaries and combine it with the power of letting people vote on their phones, that becomes extraordinary. And look, it's funny, I moved my daughter into college a couple of weeks ago. She's a freshman. And I noticed that when we moved her in, they gave her a key to her room. They gave her a key to the bike room. They did not give her a mailroom key or a mailbox key, nor did it ever come up once. And while I think the vote by mail is a wonderful reform, for people of some certain generation, they check their mail regularly, and that's a great way to do it. But my kids have no idea what regular mail is. But just since we started this conversation 10 minutes ago, whatever it is, I guarantee my daughter has checked her phone 25 times. And if she could vote on her phone, she is likely to do so. If she has to go somewhere or even check a mailbox or whatever it is, that's likely not to happen. And so if we want to empower more people, we've got to make it easier for them to vote and meet them where they are.
So your foundation has been investing both in building the tech and running pilot projects. Can you give us like, where are we? What's the status of implementation, of testing, of pilot projects? Where are you in this process?
Yeah, so this all kind of started. I was working for Uber and running all the campaigns around the U.S. to legalize ride sharing. And at the time, we were a tiny little tech startup, and taxi was a very big muscular industry, and they had a lot of political power, and we couldn't outmatch them on lobbying or political donations or anything like that. And so we said, you know what? Let's turn to our customers. And we said to our customers, listen, if you want this thing to be able to stay, you have to tell your elected officials, leave this alone. And through the app, millions of people ultimately, they emailed, tweeted, texted, called, in some way, told their elected officials, hey, I like this thing, don't take it away from me. And it worked. We won in every single jurisdiction in the country. And what I started wondering was like, most of these people, they don't know who their city council member is. They don't know who their state senator is. They're not like missing work to vote on a Tuesday in a local primary, but maybe they're not so apathetic that they won't participate at all. Maybe we just have to make it a lot easier. And that's what led to the idea of mobile voting. So the first thing we did was to see, is the demand there? And so there were some technologies in the space that existed. And out of my foundation, we funded elections in 7 different states, West Virginia, Utah, South Carolina, Oregon, Colorado, Washington, and Virginia, where either deployed military or people with disabilities were able to vote in real elections on their phones. It worked. Turnout increased materially. The National Cybersecurity Center audited all of them. They came back clean. The city of Denver did a poll of people who participated. Not shockingly, 100% said, yeah, I like pressing a button as opposed to having to go somewhere. Not surprising. And so once we knew, okay, the demand is there, then is the technology secure enough? And one of the challenges that the existing technology had is these are private companies. And so they didn't want to put their code up as open source because it's proprietary technology, which I understand. Right. But at the same time, all of the major experts said, look, the only way to audit elections and ensure that everything worked and there wasn't any tampering or hacking or anything else, is for the code to be open source. And my view was the only way you were ever going to get open source code is if someone like me philanthropically was willing to pay for it and build it. So that was phase 2 of the project. We're just about done with that. We'll finish it sometime in 2025. We will make it public and open source and free. And then phase 3 kicks in. And that's what I'm hoping to kick off with this book that's coming out next week, which is we've got to build a movement because we need to pass this and legalize this in cities and states all over the country. And you guys know as well as anyone, passing structural political reform is incredibly hard because the people inside the system don't like change. They don't want to do anything to risk their hold on power. And so unless we can build a movement of millions of people ranging from reformers like all of us to Gen Z, to deployed military, people with disabilities, the civil rights community, and other people to say, we demand this, it's not going to happen. And so the next phase becomes passing legislation, which is the really hard part.
Right. Just going back to this Squawk Box video, which I really enjoyed. So one of the things you talk about is, hey, instead of just backing a horse, which is kind of the predominant way that people of means participate in politics, you give money to different candidates. What about investing in changing the incentives and going up against this notion that we just got to get the right people in office? Your point, you make this all over the place, is that politicians are rational. They're just going to follow the incentives. My experience is that there's a growing agreement with that sentiment, that's starting to snowball a little bit. What's your sense? Like, what is the market response to not just mobile voting, but also other structural reforms? What's your experience of that?
I think that people, this group is naturally inclined towards this, but I think broadly speaking, people would agree that our politics are broken. Our system doesn't work. Things are wildly polarized. Things are wildly dysfunctional. Look, we get one of 2 types of government. Either we get the utter dysfunction of Washington, D.C., where everyone only fights with each other and very little gets done, or we get totally one-sided government, and that could be the left or the right. It could be the state of Texas on the right. It could be the city of San Francisco on the left. In my view, neither of those are good things. And so I think most people would say what we have isn't working, So then the question becomes like, okay, it's not working. It impacts your life. You have to invest in the solution, right? So everyone who's here on this Zoom obviously has chosen to do that, has gotten engaged, donated their time and their effort and their belief to try to do it. But we're still a relatively small group. And we've got to get ultimately millions, if not tens of millions of people to say, what we have isn't working and I want a better life. I mean, take your home city, John, of Chicago. So you had a mayoral election about 2 years ago, and Brandon Johnson won in the runoff. Do you know what turnout was for people under the age of 30?
Well, I know because I read your book.
Right.
But
4%.
yeah.
Right. So like literally,
Right.
The people whose lives are the most affected, right? The people for
Right.
whom the schools, the neighborhoods, the safety sort of mean the most. And they've got to decide, like, do I want to raise my family here in the city or do I want to move somewhere else like the suburbs? They're the ones that have the most at stake, and yet they don't participate at all. And we've got to show them, like, look, there is a way for you to change this, and you can do it in a way that fits with your life. It's on your phone, which you're already looking at all day. And I think that if we can show them it's possible, we can mobilize them and we can force change on the system. And I think that the reason we can win is for the very point that you just made, which is people are frustrated. They're widely aware of it. And look, I assume pretty much all of us watched the debate last night because we're all interested in politics. And like, at least one side of it, regardless of your views, like I think you felt that whatever side you didn't agree with was kind of crazy, right? And ultimately, like that is not what we should be having. And so I think people know that we need and deserve a lot better.
So right now, like when you describe the implementation of mobile voting, you're kind of testing these situations with voters with disabilities and active service military.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see expanding that without having to pass major legislation? Is there ways to do pilots that just go broader?
We're looking at that to see effectively what legal authority election officials have, because there are some election officials that very much do support reform and better ways to do things. So there are some other individual groups that we think maybe could work. So Native American voters, people in climate emergencies where, for example, we're entering hurricane season. You certainly can't vote in your local polling place or receive mail if you have to evacuate your home. College students. So yes, there are other groups we could expand into, but my view is ultimately this only really works if we can materially move the turnout numbers in primaries, and that's going to require making this available to everyone. So my view is I have a limited amount of resources and firepower to pass legislation, and I'm going to go for trying to make it available to everyone, doing it in an incremental way. So let's start with city council elections, school board elections. I'm not arguing that the presidential election this year or even in 2028 should be decided on mobile voting. I'm saying let's start at the local level, give voters an additional option, see how it works, and go from there.
I like that too, that it's not replace X with Y, it's add Y to X. It's just another option for people to vote. All right, we're going to open it up for questions in just a few minutes. If you have a question, put your name, your state, and a one-sentence description in the chat, and it'll go in the queue, and then I'll call on you. A couple final questions, Bradley, before we open it up. I was thinking about this when I read the book, what the impact would be of enacting, let's say you do full mobile voting in closed primary states, where independents are not allowed to vote in the primary, but you do have a mobile voting system. I was like, wait a minute, that might help build pressure to open the primaries. Like if you actually make it more, and then there's all these people saying, oh, I can vote easily, but I'm not allowed to vote.
Totally.
That might actually be an interesting angle.
Yeah.
Does that
so for sure. Yeah, very much so. Because as a venture capitalist, one of the strategies that I've learned in order to legalize the different companies that we invest in is once the genie's out of the bottle, you can't put it back in, right? Once people see that there's an easier, better way that they could do something, and then they're not allowed to do it, then they feel deprived. So the challenge that we have right now, whether it's open primaries or ranked choice voting or Final Five or whatever, I support all of them, but whatever it is we've got to say, oh, you should add this thing to your life to make it better, but no one feels like they're being screwed over by not getting it, right? But all of a sudden, when independent voters like me, and I live in New York City, I live in Manhattan, and effectively I'm totally disenfranchised and can only vote in general elections where my vote is completely pointless, right? But if people start to say, oh, look, my cousin who's a Republican or Democrat or whatever it is was just able to vote, why am I being punished for being an independent? I think that does build a lot of pressure in favor of open primaries and would really, the ultimate goal here, at least from my perspective, would be everyone can vote in every election using the best technology available to make it as easy as possible. Like, that's what I'm going for.
Here, here. One last question, then we're going to open it up. New York Times ran this expose this last week about the dismal state of political competition in the general election.
Yep.
That, and to me, it's one of these chicken and egg situations where you have literally 50% of races in this country feature one candidate. That's it. The Democratic Party, they don't even run candidates in like half the country. And the Republicans don't run candidates in the cities. And I was thinking, like, I wanted to know if this was an angle that you've explored, was whether if you went to a mobile voting situation that helped increase turnout, does increased turnout help mobilize and motivate people to run for office?
Yeah, like, I think it does totally. So let me give you a real life example that I live. So my sister is married to a guy named Josh Gottheimer. Josh is a member of Congress from New Jersey, and Josh is very lucky. And the reason why Josh is so lucky is he is in one of the remaining 25 swing districts in this country. And as a result, he has the freedom and the luxury to work with everybody. He's a Democrat, but he started this thing called the Problem Solvers Caucus that is, bipartisan group in the House. He works with centrists, he works with right wingers, he works with left wingers on whatever issue he's working on. He builds whatever coalition he needs to build to get things done. The reason why Josh can afford to do that is he's one of the remaining few politicians whose voters make the decision in the general election, and therefore he is actually rewarded for being bipartisan and working with other people, not punished for it. But he is one of 25 out of 435, let alone state legislatures and city councils and things like that. And so as a result, if you want to run for office, but your district, was totally gerrymandered, so only the primary mattered, and primary turnout in your district was 10, 12%, you are held hostage completely to the base, whether it's the far left or the far right, or a bunch of big special interests. If you're capable of having a good career doing something else, why would you want to just go and have to parrot talking points to appease a bunch of lunatics and know that you can't get anything done, right? The pay's not that great. Benefits are good, but overall, there are better ways to make a living. And so, yes, if you have the freedom and luxury to be successful, of course, we'll get really good people to run for office. But if you are totally hostage to the extremes, there's no incentive to do so. So, look, in a perfect world, we wouldn't have gerrymandering. I can't imagine that anyone on this call would disagree with that, right? But the Supreme Court has also made it pretty clear that that's not happening. So what is the next best solution? It's to materially improve primary turnout, to move things to the middle so that you're not being held hostage by the base. And the way to do that is A, open primaries, but B, mobile voting.
Got it. All right, we're going to open it up. Our first question comes from Mike in Pennsylvania about using the Uber advocacy model. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting conversation. I'm looking forward to reading the book.
Thank you.
My question is about strategy and how you came to the conclusion about using the technology to advocate for mobile voting when, as you acknowledge, it's really difficult to do electoral reform. Yeah. And so, as opposed to the idea of using your Uber advocacy model to lobby for other issues that voters think, or solutions, I should say, that voters think are important. So for example, you said gun control, you're talking about gun control with Chris Jacobs. If there's overwhelming support for gun control, why not engage voters as you did on behalf of Uber using technology, as opposed to trying to educate people about candidates and primary voting and legalizing mobile voting?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so one is, we do that a lot, right? So especially for a lot of the companies that I invest in as a venture capitalist, we will frequently mobilize our customer base to tell their elected officials to leave this thing alone. But the real challenge that we have is the elected officials have to believe that there is a credible threat to their next election for that to be effective. So the reason that it worked for Uber is that, it was mainly local elections where turnout is really, really low, right? Even here in New York City, the biggest city in America, you can win a council seat with 7,000 votes in the primary. And so that if I could have, 6,000 people from your district who are all registered voters in your district tell you, hey, leave this thing alone. And at the same time, my opposition is not the NRA or the teachers unions. It's the taxi guys that, give a couple of grand per campaign cycle to the city council members. I'm able to change the inputs enough to change the outputs. When it comes to something like gun control, unless the politicians on the Republican side believe that those people who are reaching out to them are truly now going to start voting in primaries, they're not going to risk pissing off the NRA because they know that NRA members turn out. And so, it just requires a very specific set of circumstances for that to work. So on the tech side, I'll give you an example. Airbnb tried to do what we did for Uber, and it didn't work. And the reason it didn't work, it isn't because, they use different software than we did or anything else. It's simply that in Airbnb, all the scale is on the guest side, right? So by definition, if I'm from Stockholm and I'm staying at an Airbnb in Chicago, I might be willing to tell the Chicago alderman, hey, leave this thing alone. But I'm the alderman, some guy from Stockholm's emailing me, I don't care, right? It means nothing at all. And the hosts, there are not enough of them to make a difference. So, I think, what you're saying absolutely can work. It just requires very specific situations. But imagine on the flip side, once we have mobile voting, then the threat becomes so much more credible, right? Because now it's not like when I ran the campaigns to legalize FanDuel around the country, what we would say to a state rep in Tennessee or whatever it was would be like, listen, you have 4,214 FanDuel and DraftKings customers in your district. Let's be honest. They don't know who you are. They don't even know what a state rep is, most likely, but they love fantasy sports betting. And if you take it away from them, we're going to register them and we're going to drive them out to the polls and they're going to vote against you. That was kind of a bit of a bluff because it's really hard to drive 4,000 people to the polls, right? But guess what? All 4,000 of those people by definition have phones because that's how they're accessing FanDuel in the first place. And if I said, I'm going to tell them all to vote against you because you took this thing away from them, that becomes highly credible. So I think ultimately it comes down to sort of how credible the threat is. And if we have mobile voting, the threat becomes on almost any issue incredibly credible.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Thanks.
Sure.
All right. We're going to go to Ramon Perez from Florida, who has a question about your new open source tech. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Ramon.
sure.
Hey, Bradley, it's Ramon. And as you know, for our project, we use the Votes app, and it's great. It's very secure. We like it a lot. But as you pointed out, it is a commercial product. So the intellectual property is not public. And so I think that this is news to me that you're actually talking about open sourcing your project Vote Hub. And I think that's really exciting because it would allow developers like us to customize on top of that. So
that's
do you have any thoughts about that?
Totally. Like I don't know whether or not it ends up on GitHub. Like that's sort of a level of decision making that we haven't gotten to yet, to be honest. But yeah, look, I like Nimit and Votes a lot. And the truth is we've used them a lot in those pilots and they've done a great job, right? And if the world said, yeah, we're cool with this, that would have been fine with me. I wouldn't have been to spend $10 million of my own money to build this thing. But the very fact that by definition, Nimit can't make his code open source because then that ruins his business meant that we were always stuck in this chicken and egg. So my hope is by making it open source, there's a lot more confidence and credibility because it becomes verifiable and auditable and anyone can check it. But B, developers like you can say, okay, you know what? Here's how we customize it for our jurisdiction. So, for example, we have built it, as you know, jurisdictions decide individually what the authentication requirements are to decide that you're you in order to vote, right? So when we did deployed military for mobile voting, it was very rigorous. It was a facial recognition scan and then either an iris or a fingerprint. We can do that. There are other places like King County, which is Seattle, where it's just digital signature. and we've built the system to sort of accommodate whatever an election official wants to use. But yeah,
Right.
I would love for local officials to say, hey, we want open primaries and final five and ranked choice voting. So we're going to sort of adapt it to that. Now we're trying to build the system because we're obviously supporters of all of those movements to automatically incorporate all of that anyway. But yeah, that's the point. Like, there's no monopoly on good ideas, right? So my hope is that I'm getting something started where I'm going to put out there in the world is not going to be the finished product that's what everyone uses for the rest of the time. It's to give people like you the ability to take it from there and make it even better.
No, it's great. That's exciting prospect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, Ramon, can you just say like 15 seconds about what project you're working on in Florida?
Yeah, so Digital Democracy Project, we use this mobile voting software, but we're loading bills that are being debated in the legislature. So we started with Florida legislature, and now we've added on federal bills. And then our plan for 2025 is to roll it out nationwide. So, a lot of the security is the primary concern. If you're going to give a tool to legislators to let them know what their district wants on a given bill, they have to trust that these are real people. They're registered to vote in their districts. It's not a bot. It's not some Russian hacker. And so I think we wanted to build on a foundation of security.
Got it. Thanks. Boy, we have some real experts on the discussion today. I want to go to Chris in Massachusetts, who has a question about a recent MIT election lab study. Go ahead, Chris.
Yep. Thanks, John. Hi, Bradley.
Hey, Chris.
Just digging into some of the reasons that people don't show up to vote, fixing that turnout problem. It looks like the top three reasons cited are they don't know enough about the candidates, they don't care, or they're too busy. Obviously, mobile voting theoretically solves the problem of too busy, but curious what other innovations we'll need to see in the political domain to fix the information problem or the not interested problem.
Yeah, it's a great question, Chris. So we need a lot more voter education in general, and my hope would be that, and this is sort of what I kind of gets towards what Ramon was just saying, we can integrate with groups that are doing nonpartisan voter education so that people can sort of from the same app learn a lot more about the candidates or the ballot referendums or whatever it might be. I think on the don't care, it gets back to kind of what John and I were talking about earlier, which is you don't care because you're apathetic. You're apathetic because you think that nothing can get done because the system is so broken and dysfunctional. I think once we can start changing the underlying incentives and making the system more functional again, then more people, you restore their faith in government, and we do care. So in the book, there's a whole chapter where I sort of try to trace, why have we lost so much faith in the system? And from what I can tell, it really started kind of in the 1960s around Vietnam. That was sort of the turning point where for the first time, people really felt like their government was actively lying to them. In many ways, in fact, if you look at the rise of cryptocurrency, you could say that the seeds for it really were born during the Vietnam War, even though, Satoshi Nakamoto's white paper wasn't written until 2008. We have seen yet Vietnam, you had Watergate, and then we've just sort of had crisis and scandal after crisis and scandal ever since. And it's not just government. If you look at polling, trust in higher ed, in Wall Street, in the media, in the church, it has just plummeted across the board. And I think we've got to restore that. I do think that if you can show that you can be effective, you can get more faith back into it again. So I think of the 3 points you raised, the second one can get better if we get both better people running and more done, which we can do by increasing primary turnout. So of the three, like you said, the third one is people are too busy. We make that one easy by just letting them vote on their phone. The second one was that they don't care, and that one I think we have to do by showing them that things can get done. And then the first one was lack of education, and I think that we can incorporate forms of public education into what we're building to help people learn more about the issues.
Great, thanks.
Excellent.
In the book.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you.
I want to go to Lainey Block-Wilker now in Oregon. She's with the Oregon Reform Coalition, who has a question about mobile voting in relation to some other innovations that they've made. Go ahead, Lainey.
Sure.
Thank you. I love what you're doing. Great work. So
Thank you.
Oregon, we are working on an initiative petition ballot measure to open the primary with ranked choice voting.
Yeah.
We have vote by mail. We have automatic voter registration. We have RCV in some counties. Our obstacle is electronic signature gathering to qualify for the ballot, and our legislature has made it harder. I'm wondering if there is a way to use your technology, adapt it to electronic signature gathering so that we can open the primary. I noted that you're working with Oregon as one of your pilot states.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think the answer is yes. I tend to say yes to things, and then my team yells at me afterwards, and I just say yes to easy and everything. But can I, through John, Laney, get your contact information, and then we'll double back with you on this, because I would love to do that. I will say, and I don't think you had a Secretary of State there who proved to be sort of very disappointing in that she kind of told us she was a fan of mobile voting. She used that to have us support her campaign in a significant way financially. And then once she went off, just turned her back on it completely. And so that was a little dispiriting. But yeah, if we can be helpful, we'd love to. So we will double back with you.
I'll connect you. And
Thank you.
Just so you know, Oregon has only had one good Secretary of State in its
And
history.
he's actually on the call
Mr.
right
Phil
now.
Keesling. Yeah.
I recognize. It's funny. I saw Phil's name and I recognized it, and I was excited. So, Phil, hi, and thank you for not being your predecessor. What was her name again? Does anyone remember?
Shamia Fagan, who
in
a corruption scandal.
Yeah, she was the worst. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to go to Leon Jackson in Michigan and then Kathy Stewart in New York. Leon has a question about an upcoming ballot referendum. Go ahead, Leon. Leon, you still there? You got to take yourself off mute. You got to take yourself off mute, Leon. There you go.
Okay.
Yes.
I just wanted to put that out there that we've got some active nonpartisan organizations in Michigan here, and this is we're just getting started. We're having 40 town halls in the next 40, well, starting this month in 40 days. So we if anybody's got any ideas on what we might add to that, we're going to try to educate the people in Michigan about ranked choice voting, nonpartisan open and primaries, and hopefully enact that here in Michigan.
Yeah, and look, Leon, if you're willing to just start kind of laying the groundwork on mobile voting, I'd be really grateful. It's going to take, an education process to get people comfortable with it, and we're still obviously in the early stages of it. But if you're open to that, we would love the help.
Absolutely. I'm going to get your book first of all, and then maybe we can pass a few of those around to get the idea started.
That would be great. That would be wonderful. Thank you.
All right, Kathy Stewart in New York has a question about the legislative process.
Right. Hold on. Ahead. Hello, Kathy.
Hey, Bradley. Great to see you.
You too. Kathy and I are old friends, so nice to see you.
First of all, thank you so much for investing in the development of the technology and in a way that could really move the ball forward on this.
Sure.
So my question is a combination of tactical and a culture shift question.
Okay. Yep.
So as you start to imagine and envision, and obviously you're already putting in place plans for what phase 3 would be, it occurs to me as we're talking that, of course, a lot of what we have to do, and this is true throughout the reform movement, is to, as you say, bring millions of Americans into demanding the political restructuring.
Yep.
And that, of course, if we do that well, that is hand in hand. That's the culture shift that then makes the reform valuable.
Exactly.
So I wanted to ask you how you're starting to think about an approach to this. Are you thinking a legislative track, an INR track? Can you do this through INR?
I'm probably right now. It's partly based on efficacy, partly based on budget, right? So I think that referendums are maybe a higher probability of winning because, if you look at the polling, people are just wildly dissatisfied everywhere. But referendums go anywhere from, in our home state, and Kathy and I are both New Yorkers, nearly impossible to expensive, even in the places where it's not as hard to do. Whereas legislation, harder because the people that you need are the same people who now have to vote to disrupt themselves. but also, either more feasible or cheaper, depending on what it is. So in my perfect world, next year we'd run a mix of the two. My guess is that, so I have self-funded this thing completely. I've been trying to raise money from others. I have not succeeded at all yet. So if it stays like that, I have the money to probably run legislative campaigns, but not referendums. If other people with much deeper pockets than mine join in, then I think referendums would be amazing. So looking at a little bit of both, but kind of getting back to that sort of letting the genie out of the bottle. I am making a really big bet on one premise that I hope to God is right, which is that, once you show people there's a better way to do something, and you show them how it could affect their lives, they will demand it. And so whether it is referendum or legislation, even if in 3, 4, 5, 6 cities, we can get the ball rolling and people see it and we can drive a lot of attention to it, that starts to create the precedent and the pathway to getting it done everywhere. So yeah, I mean, open to both, and you're one of the smartest people I know in this stuff. So if you have specific ideas, please tell me. But yeah, I think at the moment, the more realistic short-term route is probably going to be legislation.
Thanks, Bradley.
Sure.
Bradley, a number of people had questions about security hacks, things like that. So I'm gonna condense those into one and have Catherine Biondo ask the question. Go ahead,
sure.
Catherine. Catherine, you still there? All right, maybe we lost Catherine.
John, if she's not, I think if I'm, if you are Hugo in the scenario, I can anticipate the question and maybe just answer it, because maybe what I can do is walk you guys through exactly how the process works, because that probably should address the hacking question, right? So the very first thing that happens is that you connect with the local through the app, your local election official, your local district, just to verify that you're even a registered voter in that precinct, in that place, so they can identify that you're, and then the next thing would be them proving that you are truly John Updike. And so from there's multi-factor authentication. So just like when you're, changing your Gmail password, or you're trying to log into Citibank or whatever it is, you'll then get a text sent to your phone, and you have to use that to then verify that you're you. Once it does that, then whatever other additional, requirements for security a jurisdiction has will then be used. It could be as light as signature, it could be as heavy as facial recognition and iris or fingerprint. Once that's all done and we're clear that you're supposed to be a voter where you're voting and that you are actually John Updike, then you get the ballot, and it looks kind of like if you were voting for Dancing with the Stars or the NBA All-Star Game or whatever it is. The actual ballot is pretty simple, right? But you fill it out, and then what the system does is a few things. The first is it makes sure that you either participate in every single question, or if you're not, that you knew that you were undervoting. You're allowed to undervote. I don't usually actually respond to every single question in an election. A lot of times people undervote or overvote or stuff like that. We can just prevent that from happening because of the technology. Second, you can look at your entire ballot and verify, like, okay, yes, this is definitely how I want to do it. Once you're satisfied with it, you cast it. You will then get a tracking number, and you can track the progress of that ballot all the way through the process. Once you have submitted it, it is immediately encrypted, and it is sent to the election official. They then take it offline, and with air gapping, which means it's not connected to the internet. So before it is decrypted, it's removed from the internet. So, so a hacker can't hack something if they can't access it in the first place. And so it's taken offline, then it's decrypted, and then a paper copy is automatically printed of the ballot of that. And then you can also check along the way. So you see, okay, ballot submitted, ballot received, ballot decrypted, ballot printed, ballot tabulated, all the way along the way. So you can see if anything happened. And then the open source code allows you to sort of check the overall integrity and security of the system. And so that's how it works. As Ramon said, there will come up with other innovations to make it even better and stronger, over time. But fundamentally, the basic view is it's encrypted when it leaves your hands, and then it's taken offline, and it's not decrypted until it's offline and inaccessible through the internet, and then it's printed out.
And what about, like, Okay, so from a security standpoint, that seems like rock solid. What about from a privacy standpoint? In terms of like being able to, someone could log in and look at these printed out forms and say, oh, now I know that Joe Johnson voted this way. As
Yeah.
opposed
So
to now, when you cast a ballot, nobody knows how you voted.
right. So you can't do it. The only people who could probably do that would be people at the election office itself, right? So you couldn't hack it because it's been taken offline.
Right.
So look, I guess in the same way that in vote by mail, someone at the election office could just sort of write down like John voted for so and so. You could do that here too, right? But short of that, I think that by definition, the fact that it is decrypted offline means that there's no access. So the only real risk there would be a corrupt election office itself. And then in that case, the risk is the same,
Right.
whether it's paper ballots or machines or
Right.
mail in or this.
Got it. All right, we're going back to Oregon. Secretary of State Kiesling has a question. Go ahead, Phil.
Hey, Phil.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Bradley. This has been really interesting. And I can't agree more with your sense of the low turnout in primaries as an existential threat. We just did some analysis that Vote at Home. The median age, half older, half younger, of people voting in a primary is now 63 years old. That's kind of how bad it's gotten. What I wanted to explore a little bit with you, though, is that we're big on mail ballots, as I think you can imagine. But at the end of the day, the key thing isn't whether it's mail or electronic. It's the principle that underlies our approach. 8 states and DC now say, in effect, if you're registered to vote, the government is obligated to send you your ballots. It's an opt-out situation. You will get the ballot, you can vote it or not. And the embrace of that principle, of course, is being fought really, really hard, as you know, even harder after 2020. So I've always thought that that's an essential principle to first embrace before you can have a serious conversation about really moving aggressively into the mobile voting world. And I'm kind of curious whether you see the model that we're pushing, which is, you know, universal delivery of all ballots. Is it helpful? Is it complementary? Or is it in some ways a competition to your vision about mobile voting? So
it's a great question. And obviously,
and I'd love to connect directly too.
Yeah, me too. John, you have a lot of connecting to do after this call. So I see it as complementary because my only goal is just to maximize access and turnout, right? Because I just feel like you said, the only way to move things more towards the middle is to decrease sort of the extremes, kind of controlling the primary turnout process. So to me, yes, every American should get a ballot in the mail. That is axiomatic, and I support that strongly. With that said, I think we just get back to the question, to your point, if the average voter is 62, 63, it was one of those, you know, you're going to get a certain group of people, but of course we should want everybody to participate, right? So for your average 63-year-old, you know, opt out mail-in voting might be absolutely the way to do it. And by the way, if that's how people of that age want to do it, great. And then I think about my 18-year-old daughter, and there's just a 0% chance that she would fill out a mail-in ballot, but a really high chance that she would fill out it on her phone. So I see them as complementary. The one thing I guess where I would disagree a little bit is if the point was, well, until this is universal, we can't start with mobile voting, then mobile voting will never happen, right? Point. Like, right. Because in politics, the best way to kill something is just through delay, right? You appoint a blue ribbon commission and you study it to death and it never happens. But I mean, I think that we should have all that. And I think we should have the longest sort of early voting period possible and the day off. And like, I'm for everything, to be honest.
Well, let me just add a little bit to that, because I'm actually not for an election day holiday, because it's not going to help the people that most need it, arguably. But I'm not saying, you got to do everything before you even think about this. But I think if you could get a lot more states to do it, the time will come when people will say, well, if you're automatically delivering it to me, I now prefer that it be automatically delivered by this method once all the security stuff is done. And so in a sense, you build a bit of a platform potentially to make it happen more. But anyway, thank you for your answer.
That's a great idea. And look, by the way, when we connect, maybe one of the things we can talk about is whether the 8 states in DC would say, hey, since we are doing it as an opt-out version, why don't we then sort of say to people, there's another option possibly available too. Would you like that as well? And then we can get a sense of whether or not there's demand for it. So great.
Thanks.
Sure.
All right. Unfortunately, we're not going to get to every question. And again, there continues to be a lot of questions about kind of audits, things like that. I want to skip that for a minute and just go to one final question from Dennis in Florida about education and how that impacts on turnout. So this will be our last question for the day. Dennis, you got to take yourself off mute. There you go.
Just did. Thank you, John. I appreciate the opportunity, and I very much enjoyed the presentation, Mr. Tusk. It's nice to make your acquaintance. I'm in the
Likewise.
crazy state of Florida, home of Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis. And on education, I wanted to bring the attention to the group here. Maybe all aware of this, maybe not. There was a recently retired Florida Supreme Court justice named Fred Lewis, a wonderful man, great jurist, fair-minded, retired. But the last 15 years of his tenure on the Florida Supreme Court, he volunteered and did a program called Justice Teaching. And what that was, he recruited attorneys, as I am one, throughout the state of Florida who would volunteer to go into the middle and elementary and junior high schools and high schools and basically teach civics, like an hour and a half of civics, so that when you ask a young person what the 3 branches of government are, they might not say Republican, Democrat, and Independent. They might actually know how this works. And I believe, and I was talking to a buddy of mine in Manhattan yesterday, a fellow New Yorker, to my great delight. He's a very active gentleman, and he is actually producing a civics video that he's somehow contribute. It was just out of the blue, and I had this animated conversation. So my question is, you mentioned education, you mentioned low turnout, you mentioned don't know enough about the choices to give an informed voice. Well, I am a giant proponent of this civics instruction, and I think that, I know that's not a question, but I just wanted to throw that out there in case people knew maybe in other states this could be implemented. I thought it was a wonderful program. I thought it accomplished a great deal because, as someone pointed out earlier, if you're not informed and if the electorate's not informed, we're kind of just shooting ourselves in the foot if we want to make a substantial change. So,
right. Hey, Dennis, just one, totally agree. And 2, to take it a step further, I believe in mandatory national service. It doesn't have to be military service. In fact, there's only so many members of the military we need. But I think, and I may be getting myself to hot water here, but when you look at a lot of the student protests that we've seen all over the country, what they're really saying is, we want purpose in our lives. We want meaning. I would argue that, doing it on behalf of a terrorist group is the wrong way to go about it. I teach at Columbia, so I see this firsthand. But I think really the underlying thing would be, it doesn't matter how much abundance you have or privilege or status. You need to feel like you're part of something that's bigger than you. That's why all of us are on this call, right? Because we believe in this cause and we know that it's meaningful to us. And I think that we have gotten so far away from that we've got to get to a world where people relearn the value of serving others, right? And that could be in our armed forces, but that could be in a soup kitchen or cleaning up trash in a park or tutoring a kid or whatever it is. And the reason I want it to happen is not so much because wouldn't it be great if our parks were cleaner? Sure it would, but to me, that's ancillary. The point is, if we teach people that serving others is ultimately the way for you to be happier, they will live better lives. They will live happier lives. We will have a far more cooperative, better society and a better world. So not only would I mandate civics teaching, I would mandate service too.
Well, I think the service thing, I've been preaching that for a long time. I think the country that's got it right, quite frankly, correct me if I'm wrong, say what you want about the conflict in the Middle East right now, and that's a separate issue, that war and how far Israel's gone in retaliation. But Israel, in my opinion, has got their act together in terms of that, because they have that type of conscripted service. And you're
yeah,
it doesn't
totally.
country.
Let me give you a stat to back that up, and I know we're over time now, but the World Happiness Report last year surveys, it's a lot of data, and when they came to people under the age of 30, the United States, which is the most successful and wealthiest country in the history of the world, people under the age of 30 were 68th in happiness.
Wow.
Israel, which, like you said, has mandatory military service, was 4th. And so I do think that human beings need purpose and meaning to feel good about themselves and lead happy lives. I think that's why all of us are on this call today, because we want to be part of something bigger than ourselves. And I think that while, open primaries and open voting is one way to do it, your larger point is absolutely right.
That's a great place to end. Hey, thank you, everyone. Thank you. First, Bradley, thank you. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you guys all for listening. I appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed the book. If you get a chance to check it out.
It comes out September 17th.
Yep.
Next Tuesday. Please go out, buy a copy, buy 4 more to give to friends and family, start a conversation. It's really a good read. It's a quick read. One final thing before we go, there was a quick survey in the chat, just 2 questions about what you thought of today's discussion, ways we can grow it and improve it. So if you can take 2 minutes and fill that out, that would be appreciated. We have a big announcement for our next one in October. It's going to knock people's socks off. But stay tuned for that. And again, thank you, Bradley. Thank all of you. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you guys. Thanks again.
Take care. Bye.